Okay, folks, welcome aboard. We're letting people in that are in the waiting room, so this takes just a couple of minutes, so bear with us. And yep, seeing folks coming in, so just hang with us a minute, and when we get everybody, Brett, if you want to cue me that you've got everybody in out of the waiting room.
Will do.
Okay. Okay, again, we're bringing folks in out of the waiting room, so just hang with us a minute and we'll get underway here shortly. Still see some people coming in to the participant list. Again, Brett and I were talking earlier, and Nicole, about how many of you have been to all of these sessions. So if you've been to all of them, just drop it in the chat there and let us know who has been to all of them. Carol, I know I've seen your name on several of them, and Tom's seen you. And there have been 5 starting back on January the 20th. In fact, I'll go ahead while we're bringing a few other folks in and kind of recap and let you know where we're going to be headed today. This is the SARE Sustainable Ag Education Program, Professional Development and Succession Planning, and this is the 5th of a 5-part series. We started in January with Dr. Nicole Huff and Becky Smith. Nicole Huff's with us, and Becky Smith out of Mississippi State, talking about that topic of heirs property. And we got Clint Quarles on today. He's worked in that area some as well, so stay tuned, more on that. February 10th, we brought in Dave Maris from Ohio State University, talked a good bit about communication and some really good information. On March 3rd, Kevin Ferguson, who is an area farm management specialist out of Tennessee, had a good discussion about transitioning the farm business. And then on March 24th, Dr. David Cole, a little more of a broader approach, broader perspective on things, and then we're going to wrap it up today with myself and Clint Quarles. So and those are all available on a Brett, our YouTube site, and you can have the link for that. But so you can go back and look at any of those that you did miss and pick up on any of that information. So
yep, I'll be sending out the link to all the recordings after I get this one uploaded, and you'll have access to all of those. And also just preemptively be on the lookout for a survey for the whole series that we'll be sending out probably either next week or the week after that.
Yep, please give us some feedback on that, and particularly in the context of have we touched some nerves of some things maybe that we need to do a little bit more work with. So give us some feedback on that. Also, as we've been going along, the chat room is open, so just drop things into chat if you have any questions. Some of us who aren't talking will probably be monitoring that. I have learned on Zoom that I cannot talk and read the chat box at the same time because my simple mind will not concentrate on 2 things. The notion that I can multitask is impossible. So if I'm talking, I'm not watching the chat box, but Brett and Nicole and others probably are. So if we need to break in on something, we can. So
to that end, I chatted you, but we're ready to go whenever you are.
Okay. Sounds good. See, I can't read the chat, so I have to have somebody talking in my ear. Okay, well, what we're going to do, Clint and I have talked a bit about where we're going to head, and he and I have worked a number of these sessions over the past 10 years or so. Clint, I don't have any idea how many, but we sometimes would tag team. Sometimes we're there the same night. Sometimes we're there on different sessions, but we kind of know what each other thinks and have been feeling. But what I'm wanting to do this today is, if I can share my screen here, if I have that up. Hang on. Yep, there we go. Okay. Give me just a second. Okay, should be seeing a title slide there on this Farm Succession Professional Development Series. Is that showing up, Brett?
You're in present. We're seeing presenter view.
Okay, let me back out of that
Go
then.
display set. If you go back in that and go to display settings, you might be able to
Okay,
change it from that page. If you reshare again,
okay,
and
let's try this one. How's that work? Is that showing a
perfect.
slideshow or still
Looks
showing presenter? Okay,
Nope, looks great.
okay. So I'm going to take a few minutes sort of to get us started here today, and then segue into some stuff that Clint wants to talk about and that we have discussed before at some length. If I can figure out how to make my slide advance work. Well, okay. Okay. Any of you who've been in any sessions that I've done, and particularly over the last year or two, I have really been pushing this notion about we have to concentrate in this issue as to whether or not this is an opportunity or an obligation. About 2 weeks ago, I was in Nebraska speaking with the Nebraska Bankers Association, and they gave me a topic on succession planning with the subtitle of why is something so important so uncomfortable. And so I began to think about that, and I wanted to sort of specify some things that clearly I think we would all admit or make this an uncomfortable topic, but then what do we then do about it? So 4 terms here that I'm going to describe and then come back to each of those and just comment very briefly on about what we can do. For a good while, I'd been talking about this topic and didn't know that it had a name. And somehow over the last year or so, I came across an article or something somewhere that this notion does have a name. It's called identity foreclosure. And since I read things like the American Psychological Association dictionary just for fun, I've found the definition for that. And identity foreclosure is the premature commitment to an identity. I'm reading from their definition now. The unquestioning acceptance by individuals of the role, values, and goals that others have chosen for them. The individual's commitment to the foreclosed identity occurs without exploring its value or contemplating alternative ideas or roles that might be more appropriate. I read this and I thought, man, we are experts at this in agriculture. We do this very well in farming. If we're in a group, I'd have you hold up your hands, and most of you would. What are the first toys we give to farm kids? Yes, we give them tractors and trucks and animals and barns. We give them toys that sort of identify them immediately as farm kids. I am as guilty as anybody else. Uh, the first words that we taught my son learned to say was alfalfa. Now I think that's just a coincidence. That's the way babies talk. But and I've told my students in my classes here at UK that I learned a real lesson when our son was young. Do not, under any circumstances, ever teach your son or your child to say John Deere before they can say Mama. That is not a good idea. One of the more unfortunate things I probably have done in my life. But identity foreclosure is just it's sort of an unquestioning acceptance of an identity. We're thinking of it now in context of farming, but it cuts a broad swath. I mean, I'm convinced that most folks are Methodist or Presbyterians or Baptist because that's simply the way what they were raised to be. That may account for political parties or sports affiliations or any other number of things that we just assume that identity oftentimes without questioning that. And for a long, long time, I've said we should allow folks to question that in agriculture and give folks permission to try something else. So the first of these 4 things is identity foreclosure. Founder's remorse, a term that you probably are more familiar with, and this is widely known as somebody who starts a business or a nonprofit or something, and they've built it up and they've worked at it for decades, and there's a reluctance to turn that over to folks. So even in a farm, and a multi-generational farm, the older generation probably is resistant, whether they would admit it or not, to turning things over because they won't be run exactly the way they ran them. So I think founder's remorse is there. I'll come back and say a bit more about that. I want to introduce all 4 of these topics. We versus they. I have a presentation that I do in class and some extension sessions called Getting to We. One of my mentors here in ag economics years ago did a lot of work in the agribusiness session. He did a lot of agribusiness audits. And this is a lesson I learned from him long before I knew there was some theory behind it. He said that he could go into a business, and this could be almost any kind of a business or organization, and start talking to people and get a good feel for the culture of the organization by how folks expressed things. If they talked in terms of what we do here rather than what they do here, that is a very different thing. Now, this did come out of some, back in the 50s. It's called interdependent pronoun theory or something. A lot of times it has to do with familial relationships, and that's where it applies, I think, in this succession planning thing. Are we doing this together, or are they, which could mean mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, could mean the kids? Are we doing this, or are they doing this? So that was the third thing. And then the last one, the obvious one that we've always talked about when we do these kind of sessions is communication issues and failure to communicate and the difficulty of starting the conversation, and the fact that families often make it harder to communicate, not easier. So of these four, identity foreclosure. And again, and Nicole, I know you've seen this in the presentations I've done. I just at random points drop in the red words, opportunity or obligation. You know, I keep hammering that point home. If it's an opportunity, it's a wonderful opportunity. But if by virtue of identity foreclosure, we have sort of obligated our kids to do that, or obligated our parents to behave in a certain way, then we need to step back a bit and evaluate the role and the values that we have. Are there alternatives? Is it okay to do something other than what we've been doing or what we've supposedly been expected to do almost since birth? Another area that I've worked in some in I've gotten really interested in motivation. I saw a Susan Fowler book a few years ago, Why Motivating People Doesn't Work, and I picked up onto that, and I'm doing some sessions with that in class and some extension settings as well. And Susan Fowler, who works with the Ken Blanchard organization, has identified what she would call 6 motivational outlooks, and she breaks them into optimal and suboptimal. And her 3 suboptimal motivational outlooks are disinterested, which really is a motivational outlook. I don't care. I don't want to be here, but it is a motivational outlook. And then she puts external into the suboptimal category. And that's sort of where we've spent all of our effort. We try to motivate people. We try to motivate other people with external items, the stick carrot thing, the threats, incentives, rewards, punishments. Uh, and do those work? Yes, but they tend to be very short run. I have wonderful discussions with my college students, and I ask them, is pay a motivator? Well, they're sitting here trying to get out and get a job. Absolutely. They think they're going to work hardest for the person that pays them the most. Um, but then there's research to suggest that pay as a motivator does not last very long. In fact, one study said that the motivational impact of a pay raise lasts 1.5 pay periods. And Herzberg, who did a lot of this work back even in the 60s, said that the primary motivational value of pay raise is the anticipation of the next raise. So I think that the identity foreclosure puts her third outlook, which is imposed. An imposed motivational outlook has us doing things because that's what we're expected to do. So guilt plays a role in here. We're just doing things because other folks think that's the way we're supposed to do. We're responding to other people's expectations. And personally, I've admitted that I've done a lot of that. I've done a lot of things, academically or otherwise, because I think that's what I thought other people expected me to do. And in this context of succession planning, then I think we spend a lot of time in an imposed motivational outlook, and we don't give people permission to leave. This is the way I've talked about this forever and ever. I've seen a lot of this on the financial side, and I've been called into farm situations where they should have pulled the plug a long time ago, but we don't. We resist it because in agriculture and in farming, we think that if we leave to do anything else, we're viewed by family, friends, and neighbors as a failure. We're not given permission to leave. Some of you work with Dr. Deb Reed, who is retired. She was sort of our ag nurse, and she harped on this a good bit. She said, in agriculture, we need to give people permission to leave, not guilt trip them into staying much longer than they should have. So I'm glad to have a term to describe this with. Identity foreclosure is the term that I've been using here of late. Founder's remorse, we're familiar with this. And again, I'm doing some work that may either end my career or get me flat out killed. I'm not sure. I wish I had a better description for this or a better title for it. Calcification of leadership. And I put this in the context of family businesses, but also organizations. And we see this in ag all the time. The person who's been in the same county leadership role for 40 years and are proud of it. And I will concede there is some value to longevity and institutional knowledge, but I think we would all admit that in lots of circles, we have people who stay in just because they've always been there. They don't want to give that up, and they don't want to pass it along. Obviously, I work in some in the leadership realm, and somebody who has held a county cattleman's president role for 40 years has kept probably 2 and maybe 3 other people from exercising leadership responsibilities in that. Same thing in families. When you've got the 75 and 85-year-old parents or grandparents that are out there every day telling everybody else what to do, then we have had sort of a calcification of leadership. I think one reason folks are reluctant to give up their role is that is the role they've had. That's what they've done for all these years. And to relinquish that is sort of a denying of hey, this is what I'm all about. This is what I do. This is my purpose for getting up every day. But I try to convince folks that that one of the big jobs of leaders or of parents or of grandparents is to raise up new leaders. And that's why Dr. Will Snell and I work with the Kentucky Ag Leadership Program. And we try to get folks to realize that we are trying to develop leaders and we need to develop spots for those leaders. I have borrowed shamelessly a story from Dr. Dave Cole, who was our speaker in the last session, that he tells about being out in western Nebraska, having a 82-year-old farmer come up to him after a meeting and had a question for him. And he said, well, what's the question? And the 82-year-old farmer asked Dr. Cole, said, well, when should I show the boy the books? At 82, the son is probably what, 60 and hasn't seen the books. So I really think this is one way we can overcome this founder's remorse is to engage people fairly early on in cropping decisions, marketing decisions, financing decisions. So that I think would help. So identity foreclosure, founder's remorse, and Clint, I promise I'm moving along. This notion of we versus they. And in this context, I think it does matter. The language does matter. And I think all of us have seen that we've gone in or we've talked to somebody about an organization that they are a part of or that they work with. And just notice this. If we talk about what we do in our county or in our farm or in our business, that's a very different circumstance than what they do. Now, another mentor of mine, Dr. Bernie Irvin out of Ohio State, had a presentation that I have shamelessly stolen and adapted a little bit that he calls Getting to We. And he has some steps to do this. I'm not going to go. Okay, sorry I didn't have my phone shut off. Hope you're there. Okay, bear with me. Brett, am I still live or is my phone taking over?
You are. We can still hear you.
Okay. Sorry. Apologize. I didn't know I didn't have that turned off before we started. But at any rate, getting to we requires some effort. It doesn't just happen on its own. And getting to we is a leadership issue. It's top down. Leaders or owners or parents or grandparents have to demonstrate that this is a we organization. It's not the kind of thing that employees or kids are going to do on their own. And it's a conscious effort to do this. Now, yes, sometimes it has happened, but it has happened for all the right reasons. And I think if we can identify and help folks understand that we businesses, we organizations, we families are much stronger, they're more productive, and frankly, they're more fun. You know, we organizations, we understand what we're doing. They organizations were always wondering or suspicious about what the other folks are doing. This does require the development and continuation of a trusting relationship, whether it's employees or kids. So this whole notion of getting to we, I think is one of the things that can be a hindrance if we think that they are going to do this with the business rather than what we are going to do with the business. And then identity foreclosure, founder's remorse, we versus they, and communication failures. Obviously, the elephant in the room. This is the big thing. David Marison, if you weren't on the session for that, go back and look at his session. Has some really, really good examples and illustrations. He does a good job of teaching that. And this is when asked to put a list together of why succession plans fail, communication is probably going to be at or near the top of the list. It's a very difficult conversation to start. We talk about that a lot. How do you go about starting this conversation? You know, death is not something we're comfortable talking about, but that's a prerequisite to succession planning, or maybe a post, maybe not be a prerequisite, but at any rate, that it is the reason we do this. We're going to pass things along generationally. So figuring out how to start the conversation is important. Families sometimes are good communicators and sometimes are absolutely the worst because they just assume that things are known and understood. Now, I saw an expression the other day, DNA does not qualify you to run a business. So we need to think about things beyond just the genetics. Parents oftentimes think, okay, the kids, they're obligated to do this. I don't need to be out here giving them a lot of affirmation. Families are, you know, the leaders in nonverbal communication. And you look at the communication world, who knows, somewhere between half and 95% of all communication is nonverbal, depending on whose study you want to look at. In families, we know it's high. We know that families communicate a great deal non-verbally by expressions or hunches of the shoulders or raised eyebrows. So being aware of that and how that can be a help or more often not a hindrance to communications. We need to have for these trusting organizations and for organizations to go well and to make this a more comfortable situation is folks need to feel safe to say things, safe to do things, and know that there's not going to be, you know, retribution. I mean, for parents, oftentimes giving children an opportunity to try something and know that they might fail is hard to do. And kids don't want to fail. But part of psychological safety is being willing to know that if you try something and it doesn't work out, it's not the end of the road. You know, you're not going to destroy the relationship over it. So this whole notion of making things safe. And the biggest elephant in the room, of this big elephant in the room, is probably this notion of sibling disputes and sibling rivalries. If everybody just had one kid, this would probably be a lot easier, but most folks don't. And in farming circumstances, it is a rare circumstance where if there's multiple kids, that they all come back to the farm. Some of them are going to want to stay, some of them are going to want to go. And I think that's something that Clint's going to get into here in just a second if I ever shut up and stop talking. But this is the one where all of us who have been involved in circumstances, and we think of the stories, the examples, the illustrations we have, oftentimes this was the thing that caused the most friction. Dave Marison in his session talks about this. You know, we probably all have seen and been aware of families that over this issue, they had such disputes that led to siblings not speaking to each other for years. So yes, it is serious. And the expression I've used a lot, you know, instead of saying, and because I've seen this used many times to essentially end the discussion, I don't want to talk about this, so don't. They just say, don't worry, I'll take care of you. Well, that's not going to get it done. here's how we're going to do it is the thing that we need to be saying. So again, I haven't obviously been looking at chat. If there's anything in there, Brett, that I need to respond to, do so, or as we're going along, you can drop things in. At the end, hopefully we have a little bit of time for some questions and commentary. But with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And Clint, I didn't know if you had any presentation that you wanted to do, but you come on board.
Well, Dr. Isaacs, I think that it would be good to maybe piggyback on a few of the things that you just said before I get to my notes. Number one is that it is an uncomfortable conversation to have, and sometimes people are not very willing to talk about their own death. I know when I give these talks and have with you over the years, I'll get a lot of questions at the end, kind of legal questions, planning questions, or somebody seeking counsel, and they'll start the question, well, Clint, if I die, and then they'll ask the question. And I've always thought, good Lord, what is the alternative that you have in your head to that question? Everyone you know will pass away at some point. I don't think we're medically there yet to upload our identity to the clouds, like in some of the movies and things like that. But being cognizant of one's own time on Earth and planning for that is, for whatever reason, a very difficult concept to grasp and control. And one of the things that I want to talk about is just being comfortable with doing so. Yesterday, I upped my life insurance to cover a farm purchase that we have recently been approved for, and going through the court system now on. We're trying to buy 500 acres and close on it by the end of this month. But the reasoning that we are able to buy that in such a tract of land in Scott County that's still intact is because of an heirs issue and family planning and people who have wished to rule from the grave. It's called letting the dead hand rule. But there are situations where parents, grandparents, great-grandparents are so worried about the future of the farm that they encumber it for several generations. And in almost every circumstance I've been around in a professional capacity, that does preserve the farm for a while, but it is punting the football to a future sale. And that's because the number of people that are involved tend to get larger. One other thing that Dr. Isaacs talked about is something that, I listen to his presentations, and he does such a wonderful job each and every time. I'm still guilty of the things that he warns me about. Right now, my best friend from home and I are splitting a 22-year-old employee. This 22-year-old is doing all of the things that Philip and I wished we had done at 22. He actually went out and bought the Jeep and does trail riding in Jeeps. We always talked about that. He does fishing tournaments and he has fun at 22. Philip and I did not have fun at 22. We were tethered or tied to the farms by both of our respective sets of parents, and in his case, grandparents. And we've talked about, like, wow, look at Caleb, he's doing all that fun stuff. Well, yesterday, Caleb informed us that he would really like to go to the lake this weekend and participate in a fishing tournament. And this was on the heels of us having a conversation about how great it was that he is being able to participate in all these activities. Both of our replies were, if we had gone to our dads and said, we're going to take off to go fishing during the middle of planting season, we would have both been skinned alive. And even then, I know that I should grant permission to leave, and I should be happy that somebody's taken off so they're not coming back burnt out and things like that, and really encouraging personal development and things like that. My resounding answer to him was, no, you're going to be in the lime truck on Saturday. So Dr. Isaacs, after this week and after the rain, I will certainly work much harder on my own permission to leave in my farming world. From a legal perspective, one thing that I wanted to talk about today it comes around to heirs and number of heirs in court cases that I'm involved with to one degree or another, or monitoring currently. 2 of these court cases are in my own family. And you know that the lawsuits are really interesting to read when the same last name is on both sides of the V in a lawsuit. So currently there is a Quarles versus Quarles, which is my father and his siblings are in an estate battle, and that's in Franklin County courts. But also in Franklin County courts is Quarles versus Quarles, where his set of first cousins are also fighting each other over an estate issue or issues. And all of this stuff really could have been done with and prevented with proper planning and proper settings of expectations. There's one additional one in Franklin County that we may have time to talk about later on, and that is a situation where a family has essentially 1,000 acres and 10 heirs that all want to still participate in the farming. I'm not really sure that particular family, that generation had any hobbies, but they certainly have 10 heirs that are all contending for the empire that were built. When it comes to law, the practice of law, it really is about setting expectations for clients up front. That is one of the first things they tell you out of law school. Don't overpromise. You overdeliver, you never overpromise. And I like that to when I go to my doctor, I don't want a pep talk. I want an evaluation of the reality that's going on with me. In my situation, I have a very mean and angry lady from the Philippines who is my doctor that I go in, and she tells me to lose a lot of weight and to take a vacation and to relax and to eat healthier. I ignore most of those things, but I really should listen to her. With setting expectations personally and with estate planning in your situation, this does involve conversations that can be very, very hard to have or very unpleasant to take part in. When you are setting up your estate, and this, you all are now in a process where you've been to several of these things, so I'm guessing you have a pretty good idea of the things that you want to do. And this is not a legal talk that talks about the prep work, gathering all those things. I'm going to assume that most of you reasonably know the amount of property you have, where it's located, relative values on that, and you have some sort of scheme or plan in mind where you're going to divide this property and your assets among more than likely your children or some other heir after your death. If you are leaving things to other than a single person or entity, legally you are going to have problems. Maybe not you, because you are now room temperature at the time that the will comes into question. You are dead and gone. But people will still wish that for your wishes to be fulfilled, and you went through a very lengthy planning process to ensure that your wishes would be fulfilled. What I would like for you to consider when you're thinking about this stuff is you're being honest at the beginning with what you have. You're being honest with the collection of materials, the balance sheet, so to speak, or the list of assets do you have. But I would challenge you to think about honestly what you want. What do you want to have happen with your stuff? And then consider, can that really happen despite your best wishes? The number one problem that I see, especially with farms being left to more than one child, is that it never over the course of a long time period works. One child will want out or want a sale or simply not be interested in participation in the farming business with their sibling over the long term. Some of you might have children that don't cooperate or get along right now. And I think you need to be honest with yourself when you're setting up a will or an instrument that is going to leave the property to more than one person when you're gone. Can you ask yourself honestly and reply yes, that your children can and will get along? And even if you've asked yourself that and you've convinced yourself of that, have you asked somebody that is in your close inner circle if they think your children can get along? And if those people are being honest with you, sometimes they have radically different answers to that question than you might. One question that I do have to people that are setting up farm estate plans, in particular when it comes to the land, is what do you really want them to do with the farm after you're gone? And most of the time people reply, well, it's typically the boys, I want the boys to run it. And you really need to ask yourself why in that situation. Why do you want your boys or the girls or the kids to run the farm? Are you leaving them a farm, which is a tract of dirt with improvements on it, maybe a residence, that kind of thing, but you're leaving them property? But what you are really intending to do in your mind is leave them a job after you're gone. And have you had an honest conversation with your kids about whether or not they want the job that you're fixing to leave to them? And can you be honest with yourself and say, well, the kids are always going to say yes to please us because we're the parents, they don't want to disappoint us. Look around at all the other farms that have sold in your neighborhood or area that have been the result of not a sale where somebody is simply retiring, but estate sales where the kids cannot get along. That mom and dad might have left them the farm, but the farm is ultimately sold because the kids do not want the job, and you've left it to more than one of them, and you're leaving them in a financial position where they're not able to participate in the farming going forward. If you are leaving a farm to more than one person, have you considered that one or more of the parties that you're leaving them to, the farm to, will not be able to be in a position to buy the other ones out when you're gone? If you're leaving a farm to two kids and one child is not able to financially buy out the other one, there will be an auction one day. That's all there is to it. You've loved them equally, you've left them the gift equally, and regardless of one child's desire to operate the farm and move forward, they may not have the financial ability to buy out their sibling, especially in today's market environment. In today's markets, when you bought the farm, it might have been for 10 tobacco crops or 15 tobacco crops or something like that, where you could think about over the course of the note or the mortgage or the loan, I absolutely will have the ability to repay that amount of the mortgage with proceeds for the farm if I worked at this very hard and full time going forward. We're now in an area where in central Kentucky, farmland is going for $10,000 to $16,000 an acre for actual farming purposes, not for development, for farms. Farmers are buying it at that. And they're now bidding beyond that piece of ground's ability to pay for itself in not the short term, but over the course of their lifetime. If you are leaving $1 million piece of property that may not have been $1 million a few years ago to two children, they could sell that property and be looking at a $50,000 risk-free interest check annually. And when people are looking at it like that, that same $1 million might only be able to produce, if it was 100 acres, maybe at $200 an acre, $20,000 rental income from it. So eventually one child will get to the point where they would rather have the investment income than the rental income. And because there are two or more parties in Kentucky that own the land together, any party, regardless of their fractionary interest, are able to go to the courts and force a sale, whether it's still during the probate period where the estate is being settled, or a few years down the line when Jim and Bob own the farm together, and Jim and Bob might have had a disagreement about rental income, or what's very frequent is Jim dies first, left his part of the farm to his spouse and their 4 sons. And now you find yourself in a position where Bob, who was a 50% owner in the property, now owns the farm with 5 new people that all equally have the right to sell that piece of property. So what I'm saying is, when you do go to leave a farm or a hard asset like that can't be readily or easily divided for going forward, you may find yourself in a position where you're putting the uncomfortable conversation off long enough that is going to cause an uncomfortable auction later on. If you are still convinced you want to leave the farm equally to the kids, have you done a financial analysis or asked your kids how they're doing and how they would address the problem of a sibling buyout? On the farm, Dr. Isaacs has talked about, showing the boy the books after 60 years of age. I've seen a lot of situations where people in the greatest generation beyond the baby boom, they left the baby boomers the farm and never really had a good idea of how well their sons or daughters were doing financially. Sons and daughters sometimes brag to their parents, and sometimes the parents might assume that the sons and daughters are doing a little bit better than they are. I've seen plenty of situations where paid-for farms were left to a couple of siblings that absolutely get along, but one of the 2 siblings, or sometimes more, are financially not able to continue the joint farming operation because they can't afford the capital commitments that it might take to continue the farm. In my current situation, my wife and I were lucky enough to rent a large farm in Scott County several years ago. This farm, and the last real deed for this farm, was created in 1880, where a Kentucky senator came to Scott County and bought a 500-acre piece of ground. This senator, through a will, left the farm without a new deed to his grandson. His grandson, in turn, had 1 child, and that child was 2 years old in 1928 when the will was written, and the man left the farm to the grandson for life, so created a life estate, and to the grandson's linear descendants for the time of 21 years after the death of the grandson. And that period vests in a couple of weeks. That son went on to have 2 daughters. One daughter is still alive and will be the presumptive 50% owner of the farm in a few weeks. And the other daughter went on to have a single daughter, the niece, who is selling her 50% interest at the first moment she can to my wife and I. That family went through an incredible amount of planning to keep that farm in their family. However, because nobody really owned the farm outright for all of those years, banks would not loan any money towards the farm, which made, especially in the post-tobacco period, the finances on that farm very, very difficult to maintain even basic infrastructure and upkeep over the long period of time. That farm, when we close on it, will have about 3.5 miles of exterior fence that all needs to be replaced. And what we're buying is not only the farm, but we're buying a huge financial responsibility that we're required by law to participate in. So if you do decide to go forward and ask your children to own a farm together, really sit around and think about how big of a financial commitment that can be, and think about the realities of life happening. What if one child moves away? What if one child has become disabled or predeceases the other one? And now the farm is now owned by your child and your grandchildren on the other side. They could have radically different ways of wanting to go about things. And the fight that could happen will happen because the farm is not left to a single person or entity. With my legal experience in this, leaving whole tracts of land to a single person is the best way to prevent the auction and kind of keep that farm in the family for as long as you intended it to be. From a financial planning standpoint, unless your children and grandchildren are on the same page as you, and they will be because you've communicated and had this uncomfortable talk, those are the only ways that really prevent that auction from going on a long time from now. But back to my original point and the title of this topic today, are you leaving them an asset or an obligation? Farming really is odd when it comes to that. I am an 11th generation in Kentucky. We've been here a very long time. My son in that 11 generations is the first one to not raise tobacco. I was offered a tobacco contract a few months ago, and I very nearly took it so that my son could experience the same misery I had from time to time growing up. But he's only 12. Or he's 11 right now. I might wait until he's 12 to really embrace that. And we might try it again next year. But as we're purchasing this farm, my wife is not from a farming background. She's an attorney. And to go back with what Dr. Isaac said earlier, when my son was born, did I buy him little bitty Allis-Chalmers tractors? I absolutely did. I know I shouldn't have, but I have helped foist this idea of a 12th generation on him. I absolutely have done that with my son and daughter. But what my wife and I, and my wife's also an attorney, have not done was given them little yellow notepads and pieces of paper and a legal dictionary and a tiny gavel so they can yell objection and knock on a bench with. We didn't do that. I know a lot of other professions that absolutely do not encourage their children to also be a part of their profession out of some sort of obligation. So my wife and I have thought about this extensively. If this farm that will take the rest of my lifetime certainly to pay for, we want our children to have it, and we are going to communicate it to them and structure it later on in a manner where I want them to enjoy the farm after we're gone. But what I don't want to do is put either one of them in a financial position where they physically are forced to farm the farm after I'm gone. And to the point that later on in life, if neither one of them in particular have an interest in performing the physical farm work, that we would leave that in a manner that would make it very easy to have a lease to a third party or an outside the family unit, but have it wrapped up in a trust where maybe an in-family farm auction for the lease of the property could also take place. So there are ways to keep the farm in the family with a future farmer yet to be identified at the time of your passing or death. That kind of leaves you the flexibility that you may want in trying to leave it to your kids, but not the obligation or that sense of fulfilling your wishes that you would have there otherwise. Really consider what you're wanting to leave, because I've met so many farmers that want their kids to farm and they're giving them the means and the tools to do so, but they only have an interest in farming to the point that it appeases their parents. Or you've got situations where among 4 children, one is the farmer, so to speak, and has stuck around and helped mom or dad. The other 2 or 3 have moved away. They've taken employment in other professions or had job opportunities in other locations where they're physically just not there anymore. I think a lot of people are very shocked to find out that later on in life, when they stuck around and they helped mom and dad, and that is their perspective. They are, let's call that the oldest, maybe the oldest boy, stuck around and helped mom and dad and helped them farm for years and years and years. And then the parents pass away. At the reading of the will, they are very shocked to then learn that their parents loved all of his or her siblings equally and left the farm to them in equal portions. That is your choice because you own the farm. Everyone that's on this call today is talking about disbursement of their own assets, and you can do whatever with that you want. But you do need to be cognitive of the fact that you might inadvertently hurt some feelings in a situation where somebody stuck around afterwards and really helped. They may have a very different attachment or feeling about the farm, or might have, whether it's earned or otherwise, some sort of enhanced feeling of obligation to the place, or an entitlement to extra payment or compensation for the services they helped mom or dad with all over those years. At best, when a farm is left and one of the kids stuck around and helped, but the farm is dispersed evenly among the rest of the children, it is just so ripe a situation that it encourages a huge amount of animosity, to the point that Dr. Isaacs was talking about a little while ago, that the children may not be on speaking terms after that. I have seen that happen over and over and over again. And it's funny in Kentucky Ag, it kind of follows a pattern sometimes. It's not atypical for 4 siblings. Of course, let's call the dad in the situation passes away, and that leaves widowed mom, and one of the boys, let's say there was 4 boys, one of the boys sticks around and helps mom farm. Boy and mom, while farming together, it's very typical for them to intermingle assets, to maybe not write down whose is whose, or one of my absolute favorites is, that's my cow, that's your cow, and then we keep track of whose cattle descendants came from which cow. You have mixed herds, that kind of thing. But what happens later on, while the oldest, let's call it the oldest boy that stuck around, might have a very legitimate claim to half or part of those assets when he was farming in a partnership with his mother, at the time of death, a lot of that stuff wasn't really well recorded. And the other 3 siblings in those situations are now very skeptical of that older boy that stuck around and that older boy's claim to some of those jointly owned or jointly shared assets that he had with his recently deceased mother. Mom's will, typically in those situations, is to divide everything equally among the children. So in that situation, the farm equipment and some of the farm assets like cattle, the only disposition there is an auction for those items. The things that are owned jointly with the one child are dispersed, and sometimes that oldest child is not in a financial position to buy back half of all of the assets that he or she might have been farming with the last 10 or 15 years, and still be in a position to buy out the other 3 siblings to prevent an auction of the home place or the home family farm. In the past 10 years, I'm going to guess that 75 or 80% of the cases that I've helped with or advised on follows a pattern that more or less describes what I just did with the one remaining child and farming with mom in that situation. All of those, without exception, resulted in farm auctions, and all of them are now owned by different people than the four that in that situation, the four kids jointly, like mom or dad intended. Sometimes one or two of the siblings will go together and purchase something, but it's never the same as the collection of all of the children afterwards. So when you're doing this, I guess what I would leave you with, and then take questions with Dr. Isaacs or Dr. Huff, is have you really thought about how good a job you've done with your kids and how good a job your kids can do in getting along with one another to do that? I know this is kind of a dark subject, but I'll leave you with a couple thoughts about my own children. I have a beautiful, perfect 9-year-old daughter who may also be a demon from time to time. It kind of varies on the day. And then I have an 11-year-old son who got in trouble this morning for reading the Wall Street Journal instead of eating his breakfast before he went to 5th grade. He is a consumer of information. I don't know what he does with it, but he really is into global politics and trade. My kids, sometimes they get along greatly when it's dad at home and they gang up on me. They are perfect cooperators when it comes to defying their dad, getting out of chores, and generally running amok. The rest of the time, they are mortal enemies and literal physical combatants, depending on what happens. But my kids, when they were little, we were still making sure everybody was using the potty properly and things like that. And one time I found an unflushed specimen in the toilet, and I was pretty angry because we'd been going over about, you shouldn't do that. You need to do everything. I called them both in there and demanded that they tell me which one of them did it. And my kids in that exact moment both claimed it so that they wouldn't get in trouble. So that's I have two odd kids. So I don't know. Even for my own kids, I love them. And at 9 and 11, it's very hard for me to know how they will act once they're adults, possibly married with children of their own. So the review period that I've had so far, I have a little over a decade now of parenting experience under my belt. Another decade from now might be a time to review. And then another decade after that, or another few years after that, because your children will evolve greatly. You're not the same person you were when you were 10 versus 15, 15 versus 20, 20 versus 25. I'm now convinced in my own lifetime that the smartest I ever was graduating high school. And then I went to college and realized kind of how dumb I was. And then the farther that went through, I got to law school, and then I realized I was really dumb. And then I got out of that and started actually practicing law. And now every day I learn something new and I realize how smart other people are. So it's kind of a constant review. So that might be the last thing that I'll end on is once you've done this planning work, prep work, and had these ideas or plans in your mind, you need to treat this the exact same as getting on a treadmill. Once you get on the treadmill, you don't stop. You keep going forever. So once you have created the plan, you need to review that plan for as long as you still have the cognitive ability to do that. It is not a fire and forget. Get the plan, keep it, and review it as often as annually to make sure that your intended recipients are still the same people that you and deserving of the same gifts that you wanted them to have in the first place.
Well, Clint, we have proven once again, you and I have the capacity to fill up the available space, right?
And suck up all the air in the room. Yes, sir.
So if you'd like, drop a question in the chat for Clint or either one. And I do have a question, because as you were going through this, I tend to think of the dozens of these meetings that I've done out in the state and around wherever. the bulk of the questions that people come up to and ask after the meeting have almost a major majority have to do with these sibling disputes.
Yes.
Yeah, how do we go about dividing it? They don't ask the other questions, or sometimes they do, but I mean, overwhelming. Now, and specifically, and I'm always trying to collect ways of helping folks answer that question. Things like, sharing the earned equity with the sibling who stayed on the farm. We talked about that some, but another one might be insurance policies with the beneficiaries being the non-farming siblings. Does that work? Do you have any thoughts on buying insurance policies that to help that situation?
Well, Dr. Isaacs, yes and no. Number one, in the practice of law, I've been doing that for, gosh, it'll be 18 years this year. I have yet, in any single one of those days since then, had somebody call me and say, Clint, I don't have a weird question. My day's going great. I hope your day is going great. People only call me after the disaster has taken place. And sometimes when I do craft or help with a novel idea, I get zero follow-up. I don't know if my idea worked. I have a strong suspicion that I would hear about it if it didn't, but I never get the follow-up or feedback.
Yeah.
If you're planning and you do have, and I'm trying to be very respectful of genders here. It's just the majority of the ones that I've ever been around, it's been the boy, and the oldest boy or something like that has stuck around the farm. So when I say the boy, please don't take offense to that whatsoever. It's just the experiences that I've had most frequently. Your first question was, how do we spread back out equity with the boy as the boy stayed, and then we divide up the farm later? There's a couple different ways to do that. We could do some deferred income, deferred comp, or some sort of financial product to smooth that out later. But then as a farmer and trying to be something that I'm trying to be increasingly practical for the rest of my life, I absolutely hate that model. What I like is make it even and equitable up front. So if the boy is, if you and I, and I'm just going to say, Dr. Isaacs, between the two of us, my hair is definitely darker. So this situation, we'll call you Dad, and Clint is son. And if I'm farming with Dad, my preference would be you fully compensate me each and every year that I am helping and participating in the farm. And that is fair because you're capturing all that time value of money and time value of my otherwise potential wasted moments that I could have been doing something else. But if Dad and I sincerely enter into an agreement where I am working for less than full compensation with an expectation that I'm taking the farm as opposed to the siblings, that has to be written down, and it has to absolutely be communicated with the siblings while it's happening. And that is what doesn't take place. I think son and dad frequently come to an agreement. It can be negotiated over a course of weeks, days, months, years, whatever it could be. And they could have the same bargain in mind for decades. The problem is that same bargain, Dad passes away. I know what we agreed to, and I'm very truthful in communicating what we agreed to, but the other siblings never got that communication. So from my perspective, when I get agitated or irritated and want what I think is coming to me, my other siblings are seeing no evidence of that, and they're rightfully distrustful of a situation where I'm coming in and saying, hey guys, I'm entitled to a lot more than you. So I really try to avoid that conversation altogether by doing it up front. Fully compensate the son. And if you are in a farming operation where you are not fully compensating your children for working for you, you're stealing from them. And I've thought about that over and over and over. And that happened to me when I was younger. You know, the farm kids never got paid the same as some of the help situation. But I'm determined to not do that with my children, Because if I'm having them come to the farm and work for me for $10 an hour, or they could otherwise be in town in the air conditioning making 15, I am stealing $5 an hour from my kids. So I need to fully compensate my kid who would be financially better off away from me. And when you think about it from that perspective, it makes you realize how inadvertently some people take advantage of their own children. And that comes back to that permission to leave theory. I would have loved, particularly during tobacco topping season, to have a job in town with air conditioning. That would have been great. I would have accepted a couple bucks less an hour to not be sweating out there and as sticky as I normally got, let alone the tobacco sickness that came from it.
Yeah.
But if you are compensating your own children for at less than market rates, something is not going on economically correctly at your farm. And that does lead to animosity, because I've seen several instances where the kids, the moment they could get away, did, because they could make more money elsewhere. And that left such a bitter taste in their mouth that they never wanted to return or participate. They wanted to be emancipated from the farm as quickly as possible.
Well, right now, Clint, I feel like that we've stolen 5 minutes of these folks' times because we're at 1:05.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes. And
So-
everybody, Dr. Isaacs will compensate you for that 5 minutes. Absolutely.
Yes, at the rate that I would pay Clint. So,
Yes, or double,
thank you all very much for participating in this. I know some of you have been around most of these. Again, we do have these recorded on YouTube, and Brett, you're going to share that information with folks. Dr. Huff, do you have anything you want to have a closing comment here?
No, it's great information. I just want to echo what you said, and just thanking everyone for thanking them for attending this series. And we know that schedules are hard to manage, and so whether you're watching, have watched live or catch the recording, it's such a wealth of information. Thank you to Brett for helping to bring this to fruition, and just like Clint and our other speakers, such great information to help just kind of move that needle on what we can do here in cooperative extension to help with succession planning, with leadership transitions, with estate planning, with having difficult conversations. And so I am thankful. I think it's been a successful series, and looking forward to future projects as we continue to identify more things we can do to support these topics across Kentucky.
Indeed, and appreciation to Sarah and the Sustainable